Hello and welcome. Today I'm looking at X-Men Age of Apocalypse Omnibus. It just came out last week and it is still available through many retailers. So while it's still available and at an affordable price, I want to answer two questions for you. Is this worth buying? And is it any good? To me, I don't think those two questions necessarily have the same answer. I think it really depends on who you are as an X-Men fan. If you've been reading X-Men for a long time and you've never read this, like myself, or if you're a new X-Men fan, is it worth buying this? So, to give you a little context, I had never read this before. Just over the past few days was the first time I had ever read this story. I got this on Saturday, and over the past 3 days, I've been binging this, and I went through all 1,000 pages of this omnibus. I've been reading X-Men for most of my life. The very first few comics I ever bought with my own money as a little 11-year-old was the X-Men Fall of the Mutants. These are the same three comics that I've had for 35, almost 40 years now. So I am very versed in X-Men lore. I'd even had comics before I bought these, but again, these are some of the very first that I spent my own money on, my allowance, and went and bought these at the local drugstore in Holman, Wisconsin. So, but I still read comics today. Still been buying X-Men. These are the last ones I've bought. I've been reading, Jed McKay's X-Men and Gail Simone's Uncanny X-Men, but I haven't bought any of the new issues, mainly because I have just basically switched over to buying omnibuses now and collected editions, and I'm not really buying single issues anymore. I'm just going to wait for this stuff to come out in omnibus format. I'm not saying they're bad. To me, they're kind of like in the middle. They're not the worst X-Men comics I've ever read, but they're also not the best. But I'm waiting for that stuff to come out in omnibus. Basically, like I said, I've just been buying omnibuses for the past 6 or 7 months, maybe a year now. Is this worth buying? And I think when we look at that question, we need to kind of examine what kind of X-Men fan you are. Because for me, I had never read this before. There was a gap in my comic book buying from about 1993 to 2001 was when I went off to college, and I just stopped buying comic books for a period of about 8 to 9 years. And this came out in 1995, and I had never read it before. Over the past few days, binging this was the very first time I had read this story. So, as somebody who is a huge X-Men fan and has read basically everything else except for the 90s X-Men run, I would say this is an amazing read and you should definitely pick this up. Now, as somebody who is a new X-Men fan, maybe you were watching X-Men 97 or X-Men the animated series, and that's basically the only exposure you've ever had to this, except for maybe a few of the movies and stuff. And you want to get into buying collected editions, big omnibuses like this, which I recommend. Omnibus is the best way to read comics nowadays. Like I said, I've stopped buying single issues. Once I started getting into the omnibuses, this is the best way to read comics, in my opinion. But as a new X-Men fan, I don't know if this would be the one to buy. Let's say you only have enough money to buy like one or two omnibus. What would you buy instead of Age of Apocalypse and why? I think Age of Apocalypse is a great story, and in a couple minutes, I'm going to crack this open and we'll look through it and I'll talk about the things I really love about this and a couple things I don't really like about it. I, as a brand new reader, would not start here. I know X-Men 97 is doing like an Age of Apocalypse kind of storyline right now, but I would not start reading here. This has a lot of history that it kind of covers, and I wouldn't start reading here. Honestly, the best place to always start is going to be Giant Size X, Uncanny X-Men Volume 1 by Chris Claremont and Dave Cockrum and John Byrne. This is amazing, but unfortunately, this is out of print, and getting it on the secondary market is going to be, double the cover price. So, what is in print right now that you could buy that would be a good jumping on point? To me, I think it would either be one of these two, and you can still get either of these omnibuses at many retailers. I buy most of my stuff from cheapgraphicnovels.com. I'm not sponsored by them, but that's where I buy most of my stuff. But the X-Men Mutant Massacre Prelude, I think, would be a good jumping on point. This omnibus has a really good era of the Uncanny X-Men by Chris Claremont, and John Romita Jr. does some of the art in here and some other artists. But it also has the beginning of X Factor, and then the whole X Factor arc with the X-Men really kind of concludes all the way up to Inferno. And you can get this omnibus pretty cheap right now. So I would go for that as a start. And then Mutant Massacre Omnibus is great. You can still get this one on the secondary market pretty cheap, just a little bit more than what the cover price is. And Fall of the Mutants, of course, like I said, this is where I started really as a little kid. This is one of my favorite omnibuses. It's great. But both the Mutant Massacre and Fall of the Mutants also continues with X Factor, as it also does into Infernal Prologue. This one is a little bit spendy right now. It's around $200 or so on the secondary market. And then it goes up into Inferno, which is one of my favorite omnibuses. This is one of my favorite all-time X-Men stories. This is pretty pricey right now. It's around $250 or so, but they are reprinting this next year. So if you get into starting collecting omnibuses, I would say, again, start with Mutant Massacre Prelude and then go to Mutant Massacre Fall of the Mutants, Infernal Prologue, and then wait until next year. I think it's April of next year in 2027 when they're reprinting this. You'll be able to get this for $80, $90 to $100, pretty good price. But let's say you are a big fan of the X-Men animated series. I would say this is the best place to start. X-Men Blue and Gold, Mutant Genesis. This is the end of Chris Claremont's run, but this is really where modern X-Men really kind of begins, where they split it off into two books. There's Uncanny X-Men and Adjectiveless X-Men, where it's just called X-Men. This is also a great omnibus. It's really big and it's well worth your money. This would be a great starting point. So that's what I would do. If you're a big X-Men fan, you've read tons of X-Men, buy Age of Apocalypse. It's going to be great. It's a great story. But if you need to start somewhere, I would start again with Blue and Gold or with the Mutant Massacre Prelude. Now, let's crack open the Age of Apocalypse. I'm going to go through it quickly and let's take a look at some of the awesome stories in there. So let's crack this bad boy open and take a look inside. I have the standard edition cover, which is done by Billy Tan. You could also get the direct market cover, which is done by Joe Madureira, and it looks like this. I didn't like that cover though because there's a big part of the cover that is just black because they tried to smush all of this double wide image onto the cover. It has a bunch of black down here, and then there's the drawing. I prefer the other one by Billy Tan, but you could get whichever one you like. Starts off with Legion Quest, which is Uncanny X-Men 320 to 321, X-Men 40 and 41, and Cable number 20. I would have preferred if they would have put in X Factor 101, which is kind of the prelude to Legion Quest, but it's not included in here. I don't think it's necessary to have that, but I would have liked it. But this omnibus is already over 1,000 pages, so I see why they didn't. We have all of the issues that are covered in here. Basically, what they did with Age of Apocalypse was they took all of the X books that were going on at the time changed the titles and then put them in the Age of Apocalypse. Like Amazing X-Men was Uncanny X-Men, Astonishing X-Men was regular X-Men, and X Factor was Factor X. They had Gambit and the Externals, Generation Next, Weapon X, which was Wolverine, Excalibur. X-Man was Cable. And then we end with X-Men Omega. I think they do a great job starting off the story with X-Men Alpha, and then it branches. Basically, it shows all of these issues beginning, and then it breaks off into all their different issues, and then it all comes full circle again at X-Men Omega. I think they did an amazing job with that. It's one of the reasons why I really loved this omnibus. I'm just going to briefly flip through some of this, though. But Legion Quest, I thought was a good storyline. It basically goes back to an older issue of Uncanny X-Men 161, where Professor Xavier meets Magneto for the first time. It takes place, I think, in the 1960s in Israel, where Professor Xavier goes to Israel to try and help this woman, Gabrielle Haller, who survived the Holocaust, and he meets Magneto, who was also a survivor of the Holocaust. I think X-Men 161 is one of the better Uncanny X-Men issues that Chris Claremont wrote. I really liked that issue a lot, and I think it's awesome that they went back and revisited that for Legion Quest here. I think it was a really smart way to kick off this story of the Age of Apocalypse. So, without getting too heavy into spoilers, though, we see that Legion went back in time to try and kill Magneto, and instead of killing Magneto, he ends up killing Professor Xavier. So you can see here, he's about to kill Magneto, but of course, Professor Xavier, being the selfless man that he is, tries to stop him from killing Magneto, but he ends up getting killed himself. And that's basically what kicks off the whole Age of Apocalypse. They leave only Bishop back there in time because Bishop is a time traveler himself. So he didn't get sucked back into the present as the other X-Men did. I'm not going to go over what happens after that in the main 616 universe because I do think it's kind of creepy what happens, and I almost got a little teary. So I don't want to spoil that for you. But it kicks off the Age of Apocalypse. We come back to present time, and we are basically in the Age of Apocalypse with X-Men Alpha. And like I said, they do a really good job with the way that they start the story here in X-Men Alpha and then how they wrap it up in X-Men Omega. We see Bishop here. He's been surviving for over 20 years in the Age of Apocalypse, and we see who our actual X-Men are in this age. We have Magneto, who formed the X-Men instead of Professor Xavier. The only thing I don't like about this version of the X-Men is this character Morph. I have never been a fan of Morph. Even on the X-Men animated series, I find him kind of annoying, and he is in here a little bit. Not enough to sour all of this for me, but I do find him kind of annoying. That's just my opinion. But we see where everybody is. The Summers brothers, Alex and Cyclops Scott, are working for Mr. Sinister, and Mr. Sinister is one of Apocalypse's four horsemen. We see where everybody else is, Angel, Gambit. And this is one of my favorite things, though, about this, is the relationship that Magneto has with Rogue, that they got married. And we have Nanny that comes in from when Magneto kidnapped the X-Men, and I think it was X-Men 125, 126, something like that. He basically made them helpless, and then he had this nanny robot take care of them. But it's awesome to see them come back and show the nanny robot here again. But I love this relationship between Magneto and Rogue. They have a child named Charles that he named after Charles Xavier, of course. And that is one of my favorite parts about this, but not my only favorite part. Then we get to look at Apocalypse himself. We have a human council that's over in Europe that are planning on dropping nuclear bombs on North America, where Apocalypse has taken over. We have Jean Grey and Wolverine working together. I think their relationship in here is another part that I really like. And we find Bishop meeting with Magneto, and Bishop is basically telling him that everything about this world is wrong, that the world should be like this, and he needs to fix it. That Magneto needs to fix the world so that we get back to the right timeline. So to get back to the right timeline, that means that Magneto needs to send off all of his different X-Men into these different issues and books and go on their own separate missions. We have Colossus and Kitty Pryde and Generation Next going off on their mission to look for Illyana, Colossus's little sister, because she could be a time traveler. We have the X-Men here going and trying to save people in North America. We have Gambit and his externals, which are going across the universe to the McCann crystal to try and get part of the crystal so that they can change reality. We have Wolverine and Jean Grey in Weapon X going over and meeting with the humans in Europe. And we have Excalibur, which are going down to find Destiny. We also have X-Man doing his thing here, Nate Gray. I'm not going to go into spoilers though, but I do think that pretty much all of these issues, the art is great. I do think that like Tony Daniels' art, who does the Gambit and Externals art, I think he's one of the standout artists. One of the other standout artists I do think is Joe Madureira, who does some of the X-Men issues. And then also Andy Kubert, who does some of the other X-Men issues as well. Here's some of Joe Madureira's work. I really like his work a lot. It is a little more cartoonish, but I think his art is really good. One of the things I don't like, though, is this Generation Next. I think it's too dark in many ways, but it's 30 years old. It's not going to change. But that is the book, basically. Like I said, I'm not going to go into spoilers because I do want you to go out and read this yourself. But I do love how everything comes full circle in the final issue in X-Men Omega. Basically, like I said, in X-Men Alpha, they all branch off to their different missions, and then they all come back together in X-Men Omega to try and fix the timeline and get rid of Apocalypse. So, as someone who is a massive X-Men fan, I think X-Men Age of Apocalypse Omnibus is a must have. It is one of the best X-Men stories that have been told. Even though it's 30 years old, I think it still holds up really well. And even though you know how it's going to end and that they're going to go back to the normal timeline eventually, it is still a great read. It references a lot of the past X-Men stories, and I think it does a great job. But again, if you're a brand new reader, I would recommend, if you can afford it and you can find it, getting X-Men, Uncanny X-Men Omnibus Volume 1, and then, Volume 2, or this is Volume 3, Volume 2, Volume 3, Volume 4, and if you want to, you could get Volume 5. But everything that's in Volume 5 is also here in the Mutant Massacre Prelude, which is one of the other jumping on points I would recommend. And like I said, this book is still available in many major retailers for less than the cover price. So I highly recommend that. Or I would recommend getting X-Men Blue and Gold Mutant Genesis, which you can also still find at many retailers for less than cover price. Or if you want to get into the newest of the new, I would say, House and Powers of X are great jumping on points as well. So thanks for watching. Please leave a like. Please subscribe. I do book reviews every couple weeks. And the next book review, I'm going to be doing a series of novels and talking about those. So look forward to that in a couple weeks. And eventually I'll get back to talking about more X-Men omnibuses because I love talking about these. X-Men, again, is my favorite comic of all time. But thanks for watching, and I'll see you later.